Egyptians. His unexpected victories amazed and terrified the city of Rome. But at the end, because of the lack of men and supplies, he had to return to Africa, Carthage. The Third Punic War was in the years 149 to 146 NC, and fought at Zama in Africa. Because of Hannibal's skill in warfare, his strategy is taught in military colleges around the world. The Egyptians are Africans, and descendants of the Hamites. All Hamites are the offspring of their father, Ham. The first Egyptian was called Mizraim according to the Hebrews. This Mizraim was the son of Ham, General 10:6. Ancient and modern scholars have established the location of Mizraim as Egypt. The word Mizraim is a plural form, meaning Upper and Lower Egypt *. About 3,300 years before the Christian Frat, Egypt was divided into two kingdoms. A great black pharaoh, king, named Menes united these two kingdoms by conquest. The later pharaohs wore a dynastic insignia on their crown, the snake of Lower Egypt and the hawk of Upper Egypt, representing the time when Egypt was divided. These subsequent pharaohs held the title of King of Upper and Lower Egypt. After Egypt was united, her navy went out into the Mediterranean and traded with the inhabitants of the coastal towns and islands such as Crete and Cyprus. Thousands of years ago, the Egyptians established powerful governments, and built empires that extended in all directions. They even held dominion over their Canaanite brothers in Palestine for a long period of time. These Black Egyptians were proficient in mathematics, medicine, engineering, and agriculture. They used geometry to resurvey the land every year after the Nile River overflowed. Pythagoras, the EK mathematician, learned mathematics from the Black Egyptians. By the way, algebra came from the Black Arabs. The word algebra came from the Arabic word al-jabr, and it means the science of equations. When the Black Moors conquered Spain and Portugal, they carried algebra into Europe. And Mizraim begot Ludim and Anamim, and Lehobim, and Naphtuhim and Pathrusim, and Casluhim, out of whom came Philistim, Philistines, and Caphtorim. When Mizraim begot his children, they dwelt in Egypt, except they. Caphtorim and Phies, which inhabited the island of Crete, in the Mediterranean Sea. In remote ancient times, the people not only of Asia and Africa were black, but also the people of the southern European lands on the Mediterranean SCA. The black races that controlled the commerce and established colonies on the Mediterranean were the Phoenicians and the Philistines. Herbert Wendt, in his book, JT Began in Babel, says that Crete was a dominant power during and up to the 2nd century PC. This Cretan power could have been no other than part of the Phoenician Carthaginian Empire, because the city of Carthage did not fall until the year 146 BC. Where did European civilization and culture begin? Scholars say that it came from Africa and Asia through Crete. Investigators consider Crete to be the birthplace of European culture. There are many myths surrounding the island of Crete. One is, it was to Crete that Zeus, father of the gods, abducted the Phoenician princess Europa and there fathered 3 sons upon her. Zeus came in the form of a white bull and abducted a black princess, because the Phoenicians were a black people. Some scholars believe that before the Indo-European penetration of southern Europe and Asia, Greece was called Europe. Most likely some Cretans settled in Greece. Herbert Wendt says that the name Europe is derived from the Semitic word Arab. He said that the ancient Asiatics considered the word Arab to be something dark, ignorant, and mysterious, and therefore, Europe registered was the dark part of the earth. A social cataclysm, earthquake, struck the island of Crete and destroyed its capital at Knossos about 2000 SC. These black Philistines migrated from Caphtor, Crete, to the land of Canaan and settled along the southern coast of Palestine. The land of Palestine gets its name from the Philistines who inhabited that region. Original. Black Jawa. Originally all Hamites and Shemites, or Semites, were. Abraham was a black Shemite and a descendant of the name of Abraham was Abram before he was added to as Abraham. The 3 Hebrew patriarchs were Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This Jacob begot 12 sons, who later fathered the 12 tribes of Israel. Abraham was the father not only of the Hebrew Israelite nation, but also of the Arab nation. Now, The mother and grandmother of the Arabian nation were black Hamite Egyptian women, and the fathers of the Arabian nation were Abraham and Ishmael, black Shemites. At a certain time, there were hard feelings between Sarah, Abraham's wife, and Hagar, Sarah's maidservant, so Hagar fled from Abraham's house and dwelt in the wilderness. Josephus, the Jewish historian, wrote that Ishmael married an Egyptian woman. As a result, he begot 12 sons Nebajoth, Kedar, Adbeel, Mibsam, Mishma, Duma, Massa, Hadar, Tema, Jetur, Napish, and Kedema. These 12 sons became 12 tribes and inhabited the region from the Euphrates to the Red Sea in the Arabian Peninsula. This country is known today as Arabia. To those who do not believe that the ancient Arabians were black, one would like to make one point crystal clear. If your mother and grandmother were black, I am positive that you would have many colored features. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and the 12 tribes of Israel were all black people. This I shall prove to you by a gradual method. After Joseph was sold down into Egypt as a slave, we find in the 42nd chapter of Genesis that he has become the viceroy of Egypt. Joseph's 10 brothers came into Egypt. Egypt is in Africa, to buy corn because a famine was in the land. All newcomers who came into Egypt had to buy corn from Joseph, but when Joseph's 10 brothers came to Africa they did not recognize him. They did not recognize him because Joseph had grown up in the Egyptians were a black people like the sons of Jacob. Jacob's 10 sons considered Joseph to be another black Egyptian. We know this to be true because the 10 brothers returned and reported to their father, "The man who is the Lord of the land spoke roughly to us." Furthermore, if Joseph had been white he would have aroused the curiosity of his brothers very rapidly. We really do not need any more proof that the Israelites were black, but for the sake of argument, one will offer it. In many places in the Bible we find the sons of Jacob and the later Israelites taking black Canaanite women for wives. If the ancient Israelites were not originally black, they would be after the intermingling with black Canaanite men and women. When the king, Pharaoh, of Egypt promulgated an edict to cast all the Hebrew male babies into the Nile River, Miriam and her mother hid the baby Moses in a basket alongside the river. Meanwhile, Pharaoh's daughter came down to the Nile to wash herself, and she saw the basket and the baby, Moses. Pharaoh's daughter knew that the baby was a Hebrew and she adopted him. If Moses had been a white baby, it would have been difficult to conceal him from her father's anger. In the period of Moses, the black Egyptians enslaved black Jews. Another point to prove that the Jews were black is the leprosy laws, written in the 13th chapter of Leviticus, and explained in the 2nd chapter of this book. The strangest and most amazing phenomena concerning biblical leprosy was that the skin turned white. These laws of leprosy were given to the nation of Israel and they could not apply to a white nation. Herbert Wendt wrote in his book, JT began in Babel. All indications point to the fact that Asia was the cradle of the black race. It is written in the book of Daniel 7:9, I beheld till the Thibnes were cast down, and the Ancient of Days did sit, whose garment was white as snow, and the hair of his head like pure wool, his throne was like the fiery flame, and his wheels as burning fire. The meaning of this verse is as follows, I beheld till the thrones were cast down. The thrones were placed down and erected. And the Ancient of Days did sit, the God of the universe is the Ancient of Days who sat on the throne. And the hair of his head like pure wool. Daniel saw an anthropomorphic form of God judging the nations in the appearance of a venerable man with woolly hair like a black man. Daniel, the prophet, and the people in his environment, the Babylonians, must have had woolly hair for him to dream of God having woolly hair. Many Israelites in biblical times intermarried with Canaanite Hamitic tribes, and if the Jews were not black, the Israelites became much darker, of a surety, after the intermingling. Summary: there is more than enough evidence to prove that all the original Israelites were black, including the surrounding nations in the Middle East. We must consider the evidence that the Dravidians were the original black people of India, that the Cushites, Ethiopians, inhabited the southern Mesopotamian valley, that Abraham and Ishmael married African women, Egyptians, that the Canaanites belonged to the African family of nations, that ancient Israel intermarried OOEE 36 from Babylon to Timbuktu with these black Canaanite tribes. At the time that Joseph was viceroy of Egypt, his brothers could not distinguish him from the black Egyptians because Joseph was black. After Pharaoh promulgated the cruel decree to extirpate the Hebrew males, only a black Moses would have been able to be concealed effectively for any length of time among black Egyptians. That Daniel had a dream of an anthropomorphous god with woolly hair, that biblical leprosy laws of the time could apply only to a very dark people with black hair. The black Jews of India, Abyssinia, Ethiopia, and West Africa consider themselves the original Jews because of the purity of their Israelite blood. This has been stated by Alan H. Godby. Now we know that Asia was the birthplace of the black race. How did these people in Asia become lighter in complexion? There are 5 answers to this question. 1. The Indo-European invasion or Germanic invasion of Asia. 2. The Greek invasion of the Middle East. 3. The Roman invasion of the Middle East and North Africa. 4. The Jewish slave trade. And 5. The Arab slave trade. The Indo-European invaders penetrated the Middle East and mixed with black Asiatics as far away as India during the 2nd millennium SC. The European Scythians passed through southern Russia and Central Asia as far as the borders of China. During the Greek and Roman invasions, their soldiers settled down in the Middle East and North Africa to disseminate Greek and Roman culture. Moreover, they married colored women. The Jews sold white slaves to the Arabs throughout Africa and Asia. When the Black Moors from North Africa conquered Portugal and Spain, they transported thousands of white slaves of Germanic descent to Africa. All of these white people who came or were brought to Africa and Asia were absorbed into the native population. Black Arabs, Black Jews, and Ethiopians. Arabia, the land of the offspring of Ishmael, the son of Abraham, is bordered on the east by the Indian Ocean, on the northeast by the Persian Gulf, on the north by the Arabian Desert, and on the west by the Red Sea. The most fertile region of this peninsula is the south and southwest. At one point it almost reaches Ethiopia, which is in Africa. There were many Kushite tribes, Ethiopians, living in the northern, registered western and southern sections of Arabia. The Arabians have had a long history of intercourse with the Ethiopians in the peninsula of Arabia and with the Ethiopians across the Red Sea in the continent of Africa. James Bruce, author of Travels to Discover the Source of the Nile, says that the people in Yemen, Arabia, particularly those of the coast opposite Saba, Sheba, were reputed Abyssinians, Ethiopians, from the earliest periods till after the Muslim conquest. Many of the Arabs are not black today because of the crossing with white slaves in their households and harems. 5. It is a known fact that there were Ethiopians inhabiting Arabia in the north, southwest, and the southeast. How did these Ethiopians establish domicile, residence, in southwest Arabia? Because Ethiopians lived around the Persian Gulf in northern Arabia, it is highly probable that they migrated toward the southeast and the southwest. It is obvious that the Kushites inhabited vital parts of Arabia before the birth of the progenitors of the Arabs. Rama, the son of Cush, was the father of the Kushite Sheba and Dedan, Gen. 10:7, about 2300 NC. The tribe of Rama became remarkable merchants, Ezek 27:22. The descendants of Rama lived in southeast Arabia, and the descendants of Havila resided in southwest Arabia, which is Yemen. This Havila was the son of Cush. Moreover, Cush was the patriarch of all the Ethiopian tribes in Babylon, Arabia, India, and on the Nile River. The Kushites were residents of Arabia soon after the confusion of the tongues at Babylon, 2247 S.C., but Ishmael, the father of the Arabs, was not born until 1896 SC. My conclusion is that the Ethiopians were in Arabia before the Arabs. In the year 1012 SC, an Ethiopian queen named Bilqis visited King Solomon in Jerusalem. Bilqis came from the kingdom of Sheba in southern Arabia. Sheba was part of the Ethiopian Empire. This empire included Upper Egypt, Ethiopia, and parts of Arabia, which included the kingdom of Sheba. The Jewish historian, Flavius Josephus, calls this queen the Queen of Egypt and Ethiopia. Calling this queen the Cusin of Ethiopia is proper when you know the Historical background and genealogy of the early inhabitants of Arabia. The Queen of Sheba is known also as the Queen of the South. The Kingdom of Sheba in Ethiopia was one empire to the south of the land of Israel. We must remember that, on the map, Yemen, Arabia almost touches Ethiopia in Africa. It is obvious that the Queen of Sheba had more than one name, because she is known to the Ethiopians by the name Makeden. Nevertheless, it is not strange that she had more than one name. The Ethiopian story of Mikeda, the Queen of Sheba, is transmitted to us from the Abyssinian archives. This important document is known as the Kebra Negest, or Honor of the Kings. The Ethiopian account relates the itinerary of the Queen of Ethiopia to meet King Solomon in Jerusalem. She came with a great train, a retinue of officials, servants, and abundant wealth. While she was at Jerusalem, she became infatuated with King Solomon because of the organization of his affairs, his wealth, his wisdom, his understanding, and physical appearance. Moreover, the story relates that King Solomon fathered a child by the Cusin of Ethiopia. This child was called David or Menelik. 1.25 The queen returned to Sheba, or Saba, with Menelik I. After Menelik had remained in Ethiopia for some years, his mother sent him to King Solomon to be educated. Menelik was crowned king of Ethiopia in Jerusalem, and at that time he accepted the name David. Many experts in the law of Moses, especially one from each tribe, accompanied him to Ethiopia in order to be judges in his kingdom. From these experts, the present umbers, or supreme judges, 3 of whom always administer to the king, are said to be descended. In the company of this retinue came also Azarias, the son of Zadok, the former high priest, and brought with him a Hebrew transcript of the law. The present Phalashas, the black Jews of Ethiopia, claim descent from those Jews who returned from Jerusalem with Solomon's son, Menelik. Moreover, the present emperor of Ethiopia, Haile Selassie, claims descent from King Solomon, the Queen of Sheba, and Menelik I. The Queen of Sheba died about 986 NC after reigning 40 years. Menelik I ascended the throne, and his posterity, the documents of Ethiopia say, have reigned ever since. James Bruce, the English explorer, says, this is no new doctrine. It has been tenaciously and continuously maintained from the earliest records of the period when all Ethiopia was Jewish. Then, in later years, after they had embraced Christianity. Furthermore, says James Bruce, all the adjacent nations agree with the Ethiopian account, whether adversaries or friends, in regard to the Queen of Sheba. They only differ in the name of the Queen. Again, this writer says, all the inhabitants of the coast of Arabia Felix were known as Ethiopians from the most ancient times until after the Islamic conquest. These people were the subjects of the Queen of Ethiopia. They were pagans, then converted to Judaism during the time of the construction of the first temple, and they were Jews from that time to the year 622 AP. As the tradition says, when they became Muslims by the sword of Muhammad. Before the introduction of the 3 influential religions in Arabia, Judaism, Christianity, and Mohammedanism, the Arabs worshipped the stars, idols, and the Kaaba stone. I shall write about the history of the Jews in Arabia. Then I shall write pertaining to the Christians in Arabia. And last, I shall write concerning the Mohammedans who emerged in the 7th century AD. Thousands of Jews migrated to Egypt and Arabia when the Roman general, Titus, destroyed the city of Jerusalem, AD 70. When the Jews revolted AP 130, Emperor Hadrian dispatched General Julius Severus to Palestine to suppress the revolt. The persecution and restrictions imposed on the Jews were so great that a large number of Jews fled into Arabia. The tradition of the colored Yemenite Jews of Arabia relates that the first Jews came to Arabia with the prophet, Jeremiah, just before Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the first temple. In considering the Jews of Arabia, we cannot forget the Jews that accompanied the Queen of Sheba and her son, Menelik I. It is obvious from many indications that the Queen of Sheba or her son, Menelik, transferred their capital from Sheba to Ethiopia in Africa, or that they had a second capital at Aksum, Ethiopia, on the order of a summer residence. It is not exactly known when the capital was transferred or when Aksum came into prominence as a Jewish state. but it probably occurred between the years 990 and 575 MC. At this last date the Persians conquered Arabia, resulting in the immigration of more Sabaeans and Habashites, Abyssinians, into Ethiopia. Many of the leaders and inhabitants of this Aksumite state became Jewish and seized political domination of ancient Ethiopia, called Aksum. The Aksumite Empire was ruled by Himyaritic immigrants from Arabia, Ist and 2nd centuries A.P. According to tradition, the religious center contained the Ark of the Covenant brought from Jerusalem by the offspring of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. Basil Davidson said that the Great Period of Ethiopia began soon after AP 50 when Aksum became the capital of a new line of kings. It is obvious that these kings were Jews. The success of trade monopoly in ancient times, on both sides of the Red Sea between Africa and Arabia, meant political and military control of key harbors. This is the reason Ethiopia and southern Arabia were included in one empire. There was much commercial rivalry between Saba, Sheba, Himyar, Habesh, and Aksum that resulted in many wars. All of the kings and many of the inhabitants of these cities were Jewish at one time or another. Professor Godbey says that it is an outstanding point of the tradition going back to Solomon's time, for both Abyssinia and Yemen, that ancient Hebrew kings on both sides of the Red Sea had the title Bar-Negash or Sea Kings. The later Himyarite kings, after 250 SC, controlled both sides of the Red Sea. When the prosperous Himyarite kings changed their religion, they attached the pretext of religious extremism to the reasons for waging war against their commercial rivals. The kingdoms of Radin and Himyar were united against Habesh, Sheba, and Hadramaut about 500 NC. The rivalries between these alliances brought the Roman fleet into military movement in the Arabian Gulf about 1 SC to capture the port of Aden. When the Roman power declined, there were Jewish kings in Hadramaut, Sheba, and Yemen continuing the economic rivalries in trade. During the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th centuries, Judaism was politically powerful in Arabia. This power was predicated on trade monopoly. There were many Jewish kings: Abu Kariba, Masruk, Dhu Nuwas, etc. The most notable was Dhu Nuwas. He will be taken into greater consideration later. Jesus of Christianity in Ethiopia and Arabia about AD 329, a group of Tyrians, Phoenicians, were embarked for India. Their ship met disaster off the shore of Ethiopia, and the only survivors were the two sons of the leader. These boys were captured by the Ethiopians and taken to the court of the king. Frumentius, one of the boys, became instructor to Abraha, the prince. Abraha later became king of Ethiopia. Frumentius taught Christianity to Crown Prince Abraha and others. Frumentius traveled to the Byzantine Empire, Eastern Roman Empire. He had an audience with the temporal head, Constantine the Great, and the ecclesiastical head, St. Athanasius. The leaders of the empire were so tremendously impressed with his abilities that they aided him. Frumentius was promoted to the status of bishop and returned to Ethiopia. The bishop erected and established a church in Ethiopia with the support of the new king, Abraha. By Abraha's confession of Christianity, he became a Judeo-Christian. He was eager for the spread of his new faith into the land of his ancestors, the Arabian Peninsula. Gathering a military expedition of Ethiopians, Abraha crossed the Red Sea with his naval forces and army. He defeated the Black Arabs and conquered the pagan city of Mecca after a long siege. After he had introduced Christianity into Arabia, Abraha returned to his capital at Aksum, Ethiopia. By the early part of the 6th century AD, Jewish power in Yemen had reached its zenith. This power was dominant in Yathrib, later called Medina. This was the time of the golden age of the black Jews in Yemen, never to be achieved again. These business tycoons maintained international commerce in a multiplicity of commodities with the East and the West, and the Arab converts to Judaism intermarried with the original Jews. Dhu Nuwas was one of these Arabs who converted to Judaism. He was the king of Yemen about 500 AP. The Jewish sages were invited to teach Judaism to the people at large. When Dhu was heard that the Jews were being persecuted in the Byzantine Empire, he retaliated by killing some Byzantine merchants and 20,000 Christians in Arabia. This unwise act brought about the fall of the Jewish kingdom. Judaism was not destined to be disseminated in that manner. Not by might, not by power, but by my Spirit, saith the Lord. The Christians, in their terrible hour of despair, made an earnest appeal to the Emperor of the Byzantine Empire at Constantinople, but Justinian was hesitant to mobilize a military force because of previous Roman defeats in Arabia. The emperor was advised by the Abuna, patriarch, of the Coptic Church in Alexandria, Egypt, to appeal to Saint Elsbaon, the emperor of Ethiopia. Saint Elsbaon received the envoys and promised to assist the Christians. In Yemen, Saint Elsbaon organized and mobilized an army of more than 65,000 Africans. He appointed one of his most sagacious generals, Abraha, to be his commander. Abraha transnavigated the Red Sea with 150 ships and a large company of elephants. When the two opposing forces confronted each other, the Jews were defeated, and the triumphant Ethiopians marched to Zafar and captured it. The Ethiopians ruled over Arabia at this time with an iron hand. Abraha, the Ethiopian, constructed a marvelous temple at Sana in order to attract the pilgrims, pagan Arabs, who passed through this conquered country on their way to the temple at Mecca. Moreover, Abraha devised outlandish and additional inducements in order to entice the Arabs not to go to Mecca. One of the Arabs considered Abraha's actions to be an affront to his religion. As a result, he placed dung on the altar of Abraha's temple. Abraha's reactions were immediate and vigorous to the sacrilege of this pagan Arab. Abraha equipped an army of 41,000 men, horsemen, and armored elephants and marched to Mecca to destroy the temple. Before Abraha reached Mecca, his army was badly battered by a sandstorm. In addition to this, smallpox broke out in his forces. In spite of these difficulties, the general reached Mecca with adequate forces to intimidate the inhabitants of the city. They capitulated and opened the city gates. When Abraha was riding under the archway of the city gates, his white elephant remained in one spot and would not move. Because of this, rejoicing broke out among the Arabians. Recognizing an act of God, they assailed the Ethiopians violently and transformed the history of the world. Abraha departed from Mecca and died of smallpox and mortification. Because of the obstinacy of Abraha's elephant, the Arabs have called this period the era of the elephant, and only the birth of Muhammad is considered more important. Soon after this event Muhammad ibn Abdullah was born, AD 570. He changed the religion of the entire peninsula of Arabia before he died. The birth of Islam at the time of the birth of Muhammad, what were the international events or conditions operating? The answer to this question is necessary for a comprehension of the rapid emergence of the Mohammedan Empire. The Roman Empire, at the birth of Muhammad, was divided into two parts, the Western Empire with the capital at Rome and the Byzantine Empire with the capital at Constantinople. The Roman Empire in the West collapsed AP 476 after many barbarian raids and incursions. The Germanic tribes crossed the borders and penetrated into all the territory of the Western Empire, including Africa. **** The Eastern Empire was deprived of its vigor by repeated wars with Parthia, Persia. This empire could not hold its possessions with a firm grip. Constant imposition of heavy taxes, a scarcity of soldiers and agricultural laborers, economic exhaustion, a large slave class, an influx of the barbarians with frequent wars brought disorder, and weakened both the Western and Eastern empires. With the defeat of Jewish and Christian power in Arabia, the stage was now set for the rise of a new power on the world scene. This new power was Arabia. The Arabian Empire, with its new religion, Islam, established the superstructure of its culture on the ruins of the Roman Empire in the Middle East, Africa, and parts of Europe. Europe remained dormant and inactive for 1,000 years, through the Dark Ages, while the Muslim Empire mastered the civilized progressive world. Let us return, now, to survey the rise of the Muslim religion and empire in Arabia. When Muhammad was born, many Arabs were still worshipping the sun, stars, spirits, and idols. The Arabs possessed 360 idols, one for each day of the year. Muhammad was born AD 570, 4 years after the death of Emperor Justinian. He was descended from the tribe of Quraysh and the family of Hashim. His mentality was prodigious. In his youth he was never taught to read or write, but his imagination was superlative. Muhammad was an extraordinarily handsome man, an eloquent and motivating man with the power of words. In the early years of Muhammad's life, he passed his time as a shepherd boy. We must remember that many successful men have arisen from insignificant and humble conditions. Watching the sun by day and the stars by night left opportunity for Muhammad to contemplate in solitude, and reflect on the events and profundities of this world. After Muhammad became a camel driver, he traveled to remote and intriguing lands. He led his caravans to Persia, Syria, and Egypt, transacting business with merchants of every kind. On his business trips he met Jews, Christians, and members of other sects. He interrogated them concerning the tenets of their religions. He frequented the environment of the Jews and their rabbis, mostly because they were merchants and an omnipresent ethnic group. Because he could not read or write, his ears were attentive and keen to everything that the Jews related to him. Muhammad learned and extracted much from the Jewish religion, and compounded it with his new religion, Islam. When Khadijat, a rich widow, heard of the good reputation of Muhammad, she employed him in her business. He went on a business deal, transacted it with good results, and returned home at an advantageous time. Muhammad was amazed at the beauty of Khadijat. He had not seen her before because he had received his position by proxy. Khadijat immensely gratified by the way he conducted her affairs, and the manner in which he presented himself to her. Muhammad was not a tall man, but he had such broad shoulders that he looked like a giant. Muhammad had curly black woolly hair that gave him an excellent appearance. Finally, Muhammad married Khadijat, the rich woman of the city of Mecca, when she was about 40 years old, the first stage of the Islamic Revolution according to Alvin L. Bertrand * registered most mass movements pass through 4 stages or phases to complete a whole cycle, but Eric Hoffer, the longshoreman, postulates 3 stages: the vocal stage, the fanatical stage, and the stage of the practical men of action. Muhammad spent many days in the hills outside of Mecca. He was immersed deeply in the deplorable conditions of his people and he wanted to lead them away from moral turpitude and idolatry. It seemed to him that the angel Gabriel appeared, commissioning him to articulate a new religion to substitute for the old. Incidentally, Gabriel was the same angel who appeared in a vision to the Hebrew prophet, Daniel. Muhammad gradually came to believe that he was a prophet, and expounded his religion to members of his family. He went out to the holy temple to preach to the multitudes that gathered to worship the idols. With these words the first phase of the Islamic Revolution began: La ilaha illa Allah, Muhammad Rasul Allah. There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is the prophet of Allah. Incidentally, by this time the Hebrew Old Testament had been translated into Arabic, and the Arabs were rapturously pleased to read about their great ancestors in the story of the Hebrew patriarchs. This fact alone helped Muhammad to inspire in the Arabs the feeling of nationalism and racial pride, because they had read in the Hebrew scripture that Ishmael was to become a great nation. Muhammad masterminded the first stage of his revolution by undermining and discrediting prevailing established beliefs and customs and questioning other political, social, and religious institutions. Muhammad attacked the merchants and rulers in Mecca who employed the well of Ishmael and the Kaaba, temple, for monetary gain. Not only did he speak out against idolatry, but also against gambling and drunkenness. Because he spoke against the wine enterprises in the city of Taif, Muhammad was compelled to leave the city. When Muhammad returned to the city of Mecca, the opposition was intensified against him. A law was enacted that anybody who accepted Islam would be exiled. When the leaders of the city of Mecca were informed that Muhammad was gaining converts in Yathrib, they conspired to assassinate him. This conspiracy motivated Muhammad to flee from Mecca to Yathrib. The night of Muhammad's flight to Yathrib, later called Medina, the city of the Prophet, is known as the Hijra, the flight. The Mohammedan calendar commences with the year of the Hijra. It is the most important event in Islamic history. The Hijra occurred AD 622 when Muhammad was 53 years of age. Coming to Yathrib, Muhammad found the inhabitants very hospitable to him and to his new religion. There were two factors that contributed to this hospitality. 1. There were many influential Jews in Yathrib who were allies with the other Arabs. These Jews had introduced the conception of one God. Moreover, the Arabs were somewhat tolerant of the Jews. 2. On a pilgrimage to the temple in Mecca, some of Yathrib's best citizens had been converted by the teachings of Muhammad when he lived in Mecca. Finally, the pilgrims returned to Yathrib and disseminated their new religion. These converts could readily accept Islam because they were influenced to a great extent by the concept of the one God of the Jews. Eventually, Muhammad was proclaimed ruler of the city, and in his honor, the name of Yathrib was changed to Medina. Islam and Judaism. The Prophet Muhammad adopted many principles and laws from the Jewish religion. First of all, the basic idea of monotheism, which is the belief in one God. The Jewish confession of the unity of God is, Shema Israel Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. The Mohammedan slogan is as follows, La ilaha illa Allah, Muhammad Rasul Allah. There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is the Prophet of Allah. Muhammad adopted, also, the main details of the Jewish calendar, the Day of Atonement, the Sabbath, much of the Bible, and narratives from the Midrash, and many points of the ritual law. Incidentally, the Jews pray 3 times a day facing the city of Jerusalem, and the Muslims, true believers, pray 5 times a day facing the city of Mecca. Trying his best, Muhammad sought to convert the Jews to his new religion, but to no avail. The Jews were adamant and resistant to change. The high esteem which the Prophet held for the Jews was transformed to enmity, and instead of allies, he looked upon them as competitors. Muhammad needed the confirmation of the influential Jews to validate his mission, as all upstarts need the backing of someone influential. Muhammad, therefore, turned against the Jews and became their tormentor. The 2 daughters of Judaism. The offspring of Judaism are Christianity and Islam. Now history was repeating itself. The proponents of Christianity said to the Jews, we accept your Bible, morals, and monotheism. Only, receive from us Jesus Christ, the great prophet, the Messiah, of whom all the prophets spoke in the scripture. Because the Jews refused, they were despised and hated. Muhammad tried to construct his religion as closely as he could after the Jewish religion. He favored the Jews by accepting many of their laws and traditions. When the Jews refused to be converted, he commanded his followers to stop turning to the holy city of Jerusalem in prayer, but rather to turn to the city of Mecca. He changed the Jewish Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement or fast day, which he had accepted for the month of Ramadan. Muhammad changed the Jewish Sabbath from Saturday to Friday. We have another parallel with Christianity. In the 4th century, the Church changed the Sabbath to Sunday and reorganized its calendar to make Easter separate of Passover. Like Christianity, also, Muhammad included in his Bible, the Quran, accusations concerning the Jews. Nevertheless, the Quran glorifies many biblical personalities. In order to win the pagans into the Church, Christianity adopted many barbaric customs and traditions. Likewise Muhammad, to gain the loyalty of the pagan Arabs, adopted many of their beloved customs. The Kaaba stone, an idol, was to receive high regard in the new religion, also the pagan temple at Mecca was to remain as a holy site. The second stage of the Islamic revolution, the fanatical stage of most revolutions, is a bestial, ruthless, bloody, chaotic affair. The throats of men are cut from ear to car. There is an absence of rationalization and extreme fanaticism sets in, so it was with Muhammad. He had come to a point of no return. He became a religious extremist in order to give his people a better life on a rapid scale. Muhammad came to the conclusion that all means of persuasion had been exhausted. The period of patience was past and he was now determined to propagate his religion by the sword. For he said, I, last of the prophets, am sent with a sword. The sword is the key to heaven and hell. All who draw it in the name of the faith will be rewarded. Muhammad became a martial prophet, and the pagans and stubborn Jews became his victims. In the year 627 the Battle of the Fosse occurred. The Jewish tribes were defeated by the armies of Mohammed. 700 Jews were gathered in the marketplace and offered the alternative, the Quran or the sword. But the devout Jews were accustomed to martyrdom, they did not hesitate in their choice. Mohammed carried out his bestial threat, executed the Jews, and the women were sold. There was another city northeast of Medina called Jaibar. This city was the headquarters of Jewish power in Arabia. After a long siege, the city capitulated to Mohammed. Under the rulership of Omar, the Jews of Jaibar were transplanted to Syria. Mohammed attacked tribe after tribe and caravan after caravan that were going to the city of Mecca. These acts enraged the Meccans and they equipped a large army to destroy Mohammed. In the ensuing battle, Mohammed was almost killed. Finally, the Prophet marshaled his forces and entered the city of Mecca. The entire city was abandoned because its inhabitants were afraid of Mohammed. Mohammed decimated the idols in Mecca. However, he did not demolish the temple. When the Meccans saw that Mohammed did not destroy their temple, they returned to the city and joined his religion. The third stage of any revolution is marked by the preservation and continuation of the new order. The successor of Mohammed was Abu Bakr. He was called Caliph. Abu Bakr wrote down the speeches and sermons of Mohammed. By this time, Islam held a tenacious grip over the lives of the Arabians. Chapter V. Black Civilization. In Africa. Before we embark on our voyage into African civilization, I think that it would be interesting to the readers and students of African history to know how the continent of Africa received its name. First of all, in ancient periods, the Black Hebrews referred to Egypt, the guardian of the northeastern gate of Africa, as the land of Ham. The Hebrew ethnologists used the eponymous name, Ham, because they were conscious of the fact that many of Ham's descendants traveled from Asia toward the south and inhabited the continent we know of today as Africa. It seems that there were no Semites or Indo-Europeans in the land of Ham, Africa, before the enslavement of the Hebrews and the Hyksos invasion. Ancient Palestine was part of the land of Ham before the Hebrews came and expelled the Hamitic Canaanites. It appears that the Carli anthropologists and ethnologists classified races on the basis of cultural development, and not on the basis of kinship, but the Hebrews are an exception. The early Greeks distinguished between Hellenes and barbarians because they wanted their own people to appear superior. Some of them claim that they originated everything. The advanced Romans felt culturally superior to the northern barbarian tribes, and they enslaved many of these barbarians. The Egyptians subjugated and sold other African tribes that were inferior to them in culture, and they conceived of themselves as racially and culturally superior to other underdeveloped people. The Greek scholars took interest in black people 600 years after the founding of Naucratis, a Greek colony on the Nile Delta. About 1 NC, the Greek historians Strabo and Diodorus classified the Ethiopian races, black races in the interior of Africa. The Greeks received slaves from the Upper Nile and west of the Nile adjacent to the Ethiopian kingdom. Herbert Wendt quotes Aristotle, who says that the Pygmies came from the Upper Nile, which is Ethiopia. In much of Greek literature, in referring to the African, the Greeks used the word Ethiopian. Moreover, the maps of Africa during the Middle Ages show this continent as Ethiopia. Knowing that the greater part of Africa was called Ethiopia, the professor of zoology and anthropology, Johann F. Blumenbach, classified the human species into 5 categories: Caucasian, Mongolian, American, Indians, Malayans, and Ethiopians. Notice, the father of modern anthropology does not use the term Negro, but Ethiopian. But the modern name of this continent is Africa. It is derived from the descendants of Abraham and Keturah. These descendants are Ophran, Orifer, Asterisk, and Japhran. The black Jewish historian, Flavius Josephus, wrote the following: Ophran, the grandson of Abraham through Keturah, led a military expedition against Libya and captured it. When his grandchildren colonized that place, they called it, from his name, Africa. In the Latin language, the word for Africa is Afer, which is similar to Ophran, Orifer. The F in the word Afer and the PH in Afer are interchangeable in many languages. In North Africa, the Romans won a military victory, the period of the Third Punic War, ostensibly, the Romans borrowed the word Aphor from the ancient Libyans who called their country Aphor. The continent of Africa is a gigantic mass of land. Its land surface is almost 4 times larger than the United States. How and where did Africa receive its black population? Did it come from the south, the east, the north, the west, across the mighty oceans, or did this population originate in the interior of the continent through a gradual process of evolution? Herbert Wendt and Basil Davidson say that it presumably came from Mesopotamia, Babylonia. The history of the ancient black Jews indicates that the early patriarchs of the African people migrated from Babylonia, but there is a proclivity among many scholars to bypass Jewish sources, because of prejudice, and to look elsewhere for the solution in the mythologies of the nations. Much truth has become lost in the worship of many gods and in the deification of many kings. Can we put any credence in Jewish records that record the ethnology and migrations of the ancestors of the Africans? I think so, because Abraham came from the district of Babylon, which was the cradle of civilization. Abraham had the oral traditions transmitted from Noah and Shem. Abraham rendered obeisance to the one true God, therefore his descendants were able to transmit a long uninterrupted religion, history, culture, and language. No other nation in the ancient Near East can boast or claim as much. Even as great as Egypt was, her ancient religion and language are now extinct. The Hamites began to arrive in Africa from the Middle East between 5000 and 3500 SC. These Hamites were, according to the Hebrews, Mizraim, Egypt, Phut, Somali land and westward, and Cush, Ethiopia. The Hamitic Canaanite Phoenicians did not colonize North Africa until the 9th century MC, when they established the city of Carthage at Tunis. The Egyptians and their descendants are Ludim, Anamim, Lehobim, Naphtuhim, Pathrusim, Casluhim, Philistim, and the Caphtorim. The Naphtuhim settled in the Nile Delta, and Pathrusim is the city of Pathros in Upper Egypt. Anamim and Casluhim also settled in various sections of Egypt. But the Lehobim and Ludim occupied the territory west of Egypt now called Libya and on westward. Caphtorim occupied the island of Crete in the Mediterranean Sea, and Philistim eventually inhabited the lower coast of Palestine. When the Israelites under Joshua ben Nun invaded the land of Canaan, many of the Hamitic Canaanite tribes migrated to North Africa. The Cushites inhabited East Africa along the coast and parts of the interior. More Ethiopians and Black Semites crossed the Red Sea from the southern tip of Arabia and traveled into the interior of Africa. The entire continent of Africa was populated from the north and the east. Mary Hastings Bradley, during her journey through Tanganyika, relates a story of the experienced Watusi of Rwanda. She says they have an exact theology, the account of the creation of the world, and a tradition that they came down from the north. Also Herman Norton * writes about the people of Uganda having a legend of crossing the Nile centuries ago. Uganda is south of the Nile and east of the Congo. The third son of Ham is Phut, sometimes written Put. The descendants of Put have been found in the entire area below the Sahara Desert. They use the names Fuda, Fowl, Fulas, Pool, Polbi, and Fulbi. These tribes have disseminated themselves across Africa from Somaliland to Senegal. Professor Godby says that they have prefixed their name to almost every district of any extent which they have ever occupied. They have Fuda Toro near Senegal, Fuda Jalan and Fuda Bondu to the north of Sierra Leone. There is also Fuda Kassan, Fuda Zora, Fuda Furlo and Fuda Dugu. Egypt, the land of the Nile, the most extraordinary civilization in ancient times, at the western extremity of the Fertile Crescent, was that of Egypt. What conditions contributed to Egypt's greatness? The factors that made possible the eminence of these black people were the climatic conditions and geography. The conditions that played a great part in the development of Egyptian civilization were the Nile River, a hot climate, an outlet to the Mediterranean Sea, and the Red Sea. Egypt is the Nile. A very peculiar fact about Egypt is that it has little rain. The Nile River runs through this country for about 750 miles from the highlands of Ethiopia, overflowing its banks once a year, during the summer solstice. As the Nile flows toward the sea, the water brings down alluvial deposits of black earth registered, making arable land on both sides of the Nile in the valley. The combination of fertile soil, the Nile and irrigation canal, interacting with a hot climate, produced for Egypt huge quantities of corn and grain, which helped to feed a growing urban population and large armies. As a result of Egyptian prosperity, we find the ancient Hebrews going down to Egypt to purchase corn. The social scientists know that in order to achieve military expansion, economic development is a prerequisite, and Egypt had solved this problem early in its development. The yearly flooding of the Nile over its banks contributed a stimulus to learning, especially in astronomy and geometry. The priests wanted to calculate the exact period of the flooding of the Nile. In order to accomplish this, the priests had to observe the heavenly bodies. This involved mathematics, and they divided the year into 12 months of 30 days. Our calendar of today is patterned after the Egyptian calendar. Again, because the Nile overflowed its banks, this event transformed the landmarks of the owners. Real estate had to be resurveyed, lines and angles drawn. This necessity led to the creation of geometry, which became, also, necessary in construction, engineering, and warfare. The Nile played a momentous role, also, as a source of communication and transportation to hold together the union of Upper and Lower Egypt as one autonomous king. DOM. The Egyptians of the north could engage in commerce with the south, because strong winds, during most of the year, could push sailboats against the currents. The concentration of the people around the Nile was a phenomenon that encouraged ship construction and stimulated maritime trade with other nations in the Mediterranean Sea. This increased Egypt's naval forces eventually in the Red, and with all of the aforementioned factors operating for Egypt, she became a major power early in her development. The Old Kingdom. The history of the dynasties in the civilization of Egypt may be divided into 3 periods. They are as follows: the Old Kingdom or Pyramid Age, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom or New Empire. The first king of the first dynasty of the Old Kingdom was Menes. The date of his accession to the throne was about 3500 SC. He wore a unique double crown symbolizing the unity of Upper and Lower Egypt. The snake was the symbol in the north, and the hawk was the symbol in the south. By the time the Third Dynasty arrived, Egypt was well on her way toward greatness, 2980 to 2900 MC. The most remarkable king at this time was Sosur. With his power, wealth, and the of his counselor, Imhotep, he promoted the city of Memphis, expanded and strengthened the kingdom, built tombs, temples, and terraced pyramids. During the administration of King Sosur, there lived in Egypt the most phenomenal intellectual of his time. This man was Imhotep, the master. He excelled in many academic pursuits and was preeminent in the field of medicine. J. A. Rogers says that he diagnosed and rendered therapy to more than 200 various diseases of the human body. The Egyptians practiced auscultation, the listening to sounds in the body, surgery, chemistry, and the recognition of diseases by their characteristics. Imhotep examined the internal and external vital organs of the systemic human body. Furthermore, he investigated the circulatory system. Herodotus says that the Egyptians were specialists in the medical field and the country swarmed with medical practitioners. In his day, Imhotep was recognized, also, as a sage, priest, philosopher, poet, scribe, magician, astronomer, and architect. Egyptian mythology. In the Egyptian pantheon there were many gods. The most famous gods were Osiris, Isis, and Horus. These gods formed a triad. The principal gods were worshipped in a triad. The number 3 apparently had a mystical importance to the Egyptians. Horus was the son of the sun god, Osiris, and the moon goddess, Isis. The triad was very common in the ancient world and it has come down to our day. Far earlier, Osiris was the god of the Nile and Isis represented the god of the earth. The Egyptians, also, worshipped the animals, nature, and the 12 gods. Hercules was one of these 12 gods. Herodotus, the Greek historian, says that the Greeks adopted the black god, Hercules, from the Egyptians. When the Greeks and Romans took over the gods of Asia and Africa, sometimes they changed their names and color. Let us return now to our triad, Osiris, Isis, and Horus. I think that more than any other god, the legend of Osiris underwent great transformation through the passage of history. At first, I am certain, he was a subsidiary god, but he arose to the status of a sun god. In Egyptian mythology, the legend says Osiris was king of Egypt and he married his sister Isis. When Osiris went off to war, his brother, Set, assassinated him. Set eventually cut the body in 14 pieces and scattered it over a remote area. Isis, undespairing, began a search for the fragments and found them except for the phallus, penis, which had been eaten by a Nile crab. Isis recomposed the body of her dead husband, skillfully connecting the parts together. She then effectuated the rites of embalmment and this restored the body to eternal life. It was always considered in Egypt that the preservation of the body intact was necessary for the eternal life of the soul. Finally, Isis brought forth a son after the death of her husband. This posthumous birth was conceived by the union with her husband's dead body, miraculously reanimated by her charms. This mythology reminds one of the spirit entering into the Virgin Mary, thus conceiving the child Isis. Afterward, the goddess retreated to the marshland of Buto to flee from the anger of Set, who had usurped the throne, and to rear her son Horus until the day when he would be mature enough to avenge his father's death. According to another version, Set found out that Isis had given birth to Horus. Set entered the swamps in the form of a snake and bit Horus, leaving him on the verge of death. Finally, Isis was told that evil and darkness would persist until Horus was cured. Many kings of early Egypt were deified, ritually identified in the solar hierarchy as the sons of Ra. Ra remained the supreme god, and Osiris, Isis, and Horus, their son, were incorporated in the family of Ra, the solar pantheon. Some of the pharaohs were considered in the solar religion to be either the incarnation of Horus the Elder, son of Ra, or the physical son of Ra himself. The connection of both Osiris and Isis with fertility cults was constantly emphasized from the Empire Age onward, and this encouraged their gradual entry into the realm of the living. Osiris became the leader of this world and the underworld, and his name, in the hieroglyph, from the 20th dynasty onward, was the solar disk rather than the eye. The stories and legends of ancient Egyptian mythology are voluminous and interesting. They have their counterparts in the East and the West, Babylon, Greece, and Rome. From Greece and Rome, culture and civilization spread over the entire continent of Europe. Now, in order to terminate the history of the Old Kingdom, it behooves me to mention the fact that Khufu, the first king of the 4th Memphite dynasty, erected the largest pyramid. Pepi, the third and greatest king of the 6th dynasty, 2590 to 2570, sent some expeditions against the Bedouins of Sinai and into Palestine. Nevertheless, Egypt was set for a period of decline. Pepi II reigned 90 years, 2566 to 2476 NC, the longest reign recorded in history, generally an uneventful period of retrogression, with the king much of the time controlled by a powerful aristocracy. The Old Kingdom and the first 1,000 years of recorded history ends with the 8th dynasty. This was the beginning of the period of excessive anarchy. The country was engaged in a destructive civil war. There was a long wretched period of disorder, many potentates claimed the throne at once, and the cities were in an uproar with widespread confusion. At this same time, Black Hamitic Amorites, from the northern Euphrates River, invaded the Fertile Crescent and the Egyptian frontier. These Asiatic Amorites, also, penetrated the booming towns of the Nile Delta, spreading consternation and panic. The Middle Kingdom consisted of 9 dynasties lasting for a period of 1,000 years. Because of the condition of anarchy, the need of the hour was for strong leaders. This leadership was found in the 11th and 12th dynasties. Mentuhotep II completed the conquest of the Heracleopolitan dynasty. The capital of this kingdom was transferred more than 300 miles south of Memphis to the city of Thebes. Obviously, the capital was removed to Thebes so that it would be less subject to attack by Asiatic invaders. Once again the mighty pharaohs governed Upper and Lower Egypt. When the new kings had restored law, order, and peace, the Egyptians devised more improvements in public works. Amenemhat III of the 12th dynasty, 1849 to 1801, and other pharaohs established dikes and constructed colossal reservoirs to preserve the water of the Nile for land irrigation. They dug a channel through the land between the Nile Delta and the Red Sea. The sophisticated Egyptians excavated canals thousands of years before a French engineer, de Lesseps, dug the Suez Canal AV 1869. The ancient Egyptians were meticulous masters in constructional engineering. They were very accurate with the smallest details. Thousands of slaves from all over the known world were forced under harsh regimentation and strict rule to construct temples, monuments, and pyramids for the megalomaniac deified pharaohs. The 12th dynasty appeared on the international scene as a strongly organized monarchy. The kings had diplomatic relations with remote kingdoms. Sesostris It, 5th king of the dynasty, 1887 to 1849 m. Conquered 200 miles of the Nile Valley up to the Second Cataract. He established relations with the coast of the Red Sea. He sent military expeditions into the Sinai Peninsula and also into Syria. At this time trade was successful on a large scale. During this Middle Kingdom, Egyptian civilization made its first profound influence on other parts of Africa, such as Nubia, Verwat, Kush, etc. About the time of the reign of Amenemhet IV, 1801-1792 NC, and the early stages of the 13th dynasty, Egypt went through a long period of confusion and invasion. The Egyptians were so tremendously disunited that they neglected the defense of the kingdom. It collapsed easily, about 1788 SC, before a wave of invaders known as Hyksos or Shepherd Kings. These Hyksos dominated Egypt for about 200 years. This period is known to the Egyptians as the Great Humiliation. Now, after long exhaustive investigation, it appears that the Hyksos were descendants of the ancient Horites or Hurrians. A.T. Olmsted confesses that there is much obscurity about their race. We may at least assert that they were West Semites and that their chief center of power was North Syria. I do not agree with Olmsted when he says they are Semites, however. Much evidence indicates that they are Japhites, Indo-Iranians or Indo-Europeans, descendants of what we call today the white race. But I agree with Olmsted when he says the center of their power was in North Syria. The Hurrians came from the southern parts of the Caucasus Mountains and established their new capital at Mitanni in Syria and Assyria. These Hurrians began to push their way into the Black World of the Middle East about 1800 R.C. Herbert Wendt writes the following: in ancient Sumerian epics the land of Churm is mentioned south of the Caucasus, and in the Old Testament the Hurrians appear as the Kori, or Horites. In 1720 SC or thereabouts they conquered, under the name of Hyksos, the kingdom of Egypt where they reigned as shepherd kings. When the Hurrians invaded the Middle Fast, they were a white or fair-skinned race. They mixed with the indigenous black population, and took up permanent residence among them. Everywhere they traveled they established colonies. During the second millennium, the Hurrians invaded Egypt under the name Hyksos. They came with horses and chariots, which terrified the Egyptians. The Egyptians had never seen horses before, and the Egyptians probably had never before seen such a heterogeneous population of white, yellow, light brown, and chocolate people. So the Hyksos came into Egypt and established the 15th and 16th dynasties. These dynasties are known to the Egyptians as the period of the Great Humiliation. During this period the Egyptians had to suffer insults to their gods and culture from aliens. Many scholars think that the Hyksos were in power in Egypt when the ancient Hebrews came down to live and to purchase corn. This would mean that the Hebrews migrated to Egypt between 1788 and 1580. The Hyksos were hospitable to the Hebrews because they were aliens themselves. It was one of the Hyksos pharaohs who elevated Joseph, the wise Hebrew, to the position of viceroy of Egypt. Because of this, Joseph saved Egypt from starvation. In the process of time, the Egyptians from the city of Thebes, Upper Egypt, waged wars of liberation against the Hyksos. The new powerful native Egyptian leader advocated an ardent nationalist policy to regain control of the government. As a result, the Hyksos were expelled from Egypt. The new kingdom or new empire now there arose up a new king over Egypt, which knew not Joseph. And he said unto his people, Behold, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come on, let us deal wisely with them, lest they multiply, and it come to pass, when there falleth out any war, they join also unto our enemies, and fight against us, and so get them up out of the land. Much proof points to the fact that the new pharaoh who ascended the throne was Amosi or Ames, the first king of the brilliant 18th dynasty, 1580 to 1557 MC. He re-established the government at Thebes, expelled the Hyksos, and instituted something like a fascist form of government. This government was an autocratic nationalist regime, exercising regimentation of industry, rigid censorship, and forcible suppression of opposition. The period of Th's nationalist dynasty marked a turning point in the fortunes of the Hebrews. They were once well thought of by the overthrown Hyksos kings. Now they lost their favored status, and their previous contributions to the nation were ignored. Their freedom of movement was restricted, male genocide was decreed, and gradually the Hebrews were reduced to slavery. Therefore they did set over them taskmasters to afflict them with their burdens. And they built for Pharaoh Tree, Ur cities, Pithom, and Ramses. But the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew. And they were grieved because of the children of Israel. And they made their lives bitter with hard bondage, in mortar and in brick, and in all manner of service in the field. All their service, wherein they made them serve, was with rigor. And the king of Egypt spake to the Hebrew midwives, of which the name of one was Shiphrah, and the name of the other Puah, and he said, When ye do the office of a midwife to the Hebrew women, and see them upon the stools, if it be a son, then ye shall kill him, but if it be a daughter, then she shall live. During the period that the Hebrews were slaves for Pharaoh, they built many of the megalithic structures. The Hebrews erected some pyramids, they dug a great many channels for the river, they built walls for the cities and ramparts, they constructed the halls at Karnak for Thutmose, they built temple pylons, hypostyle halls, and an obelisk. For Amenhotep III, by the edict of Ramses II they constructed at Thebes the temple of the Ramesseum with its colossal statues of himself, and they built the treasure cities of Pithom and Ramses. Naturally, the Hebrews were not the only slaves in Egypt. There were Ethiopian slaves, Nubians, Canaanites, Syrians, and people from the Aegean islands, but the Hebrew slaves were in the majority. The New Kingdom or New Empire age consisted of the most remarkable and outstanding black personalities known, not only in Egypt, but in the entire civilized world. They Black civi were brilliant men possessed with gallantry and the capability to reorganize the civil and military administrations. After the Asiatic invaders had humiliated the Egyptians, the people rapidly forgot their phobias of horses and learned to use chariots. They manufactured sophisticated weapons out of iron. The generals organized horsemen and other soldiers into mighty expeditionary forces to conquer Syria, Mitanni, and the territory extending to the fourth cataract of the Nile in the R 1501 IC. The fourth king of the 18th dynasty enthroned himself. He was Thutmose III, known as the Hornet, because he wore this insignia on his crown. Thutmose III was the son of Thutmose I and a concubine, Isis. His qualities of face were pure ink black, a broad nose and thick lips. He reigned jointly with his wife and half-sister, Queen Hatshepsut, ruled alone, 1481 to 1447 SC. Thutmose was one of the greatest Egyptian kings. He began his rule by deposing his father in a palace revolution, but with his queen, was temporarily pushed aside by the revolution of Thutmose I, his father, and II, his brother. Eventually, he regained control of the government, invaded Syria with a great army, 1479, defeated the king of Kadesh at Megiddo. Thutmose III really lived up to his reputation as the Flying Hornet. He waged 17 military campaigns in Asia. His navy conquered the islands of the Aegean Sea and added them to his colossal empire. Zashan in Africa 65 Akhenaten or Amenhotep IV. Many years after the death of Thutmose III, a new king called Amenhotep IV became a religious innovator. He was not an excellent soldier or governor. He believed in one god, the sun god Aten, who dominated all living creatures. Because he was excessively preoccupied with religion, he neglected the kingdom. He ordered that the temples of the old Egyptian gods be closed, and he expelled the priest. Hood. Also, he changed his name from Amenhotep to Akhenaten, which means Aden is satisfied. He transferred his capital from Thebes to Tel El Amarna. When Akhenaten attempted to revolutionize the religion, this act divided the Egyptian aristocracy and weakened the government. Furthermore, Akhenaten was too busy to send military assistance to the Egyptian allies or to remote countries of the empire which were threatened by revolt or invasion. Foretelling of Moses, one of the kings of the 18th or 19th dynasties, was informed by his astrologer, or sacred scribe, that a child would be born to the Hebrew nation. If he were permitted to live, he would bring the Egyptian kingdom to a low condition. The child was born, his name was Moses. He was reared in a miraculous way, in Pharaoh's own palace by his daughter. The plot to destroy Moses in his infancy failed. The daughter of Pharaoh adopted Moses as her son. She came to her father and said, "I have brought up a child who is of a divine form, and of a generous mind, and as I have received him from the bounty of the river, in a wonderful manner, I thought it proper to adopt him for my son, and the heir of thy kingdom." When she put the child into Pharaoh's hand, he hugged the child and put his diadem upon his head. But Moses cast down the diadem to the ground, and, in a childish mood, he twisted it around and stamped upon it. The sacred scribe saw all of this. He was the same astrologer who foretold that Moses' birth would bring down the Egyptian kingdom. Because of this, the astrologer cried out in a terrifying manner, saying, "This, O king, this child is he of whom God foretold, that if we kill him we shall be in no danger." He himself affords an attestation to the prediction of the same thing, by this trampling upon thy government, and treading upon thy diadem. The astrologer advocated to have Moses executed in order to free the Egyptians from fear and to deprive the Hebrews of hope and freedom. At this intense moment, the daughter of Pharaoh took the child quietly. Because the king loved his daughter, he was not disposed to hurt her. When events arrived at this juncture, the divine providence protected Moses, prevailing upon the king to spare him. Moses was educated, as Josephus says, and it is highly probable that he received the best education the ancient world could give. We must remember that Egypt possessed institutions of higher learning and that Pharaoh's palace and temple was the chief center of the educated class. Moses was exposed to the best Egypt had to afford. Those who think Moses was just an ignorant religious leader are quite wrong. Moses knew the political, social, and natural sciences of Egypt. He learned the religious system, the political system, mathematics, geometry, biology, chemistry, anatomy, foreign languages, law, engineering, and military tactics. Josephus writes the following: Moses arrived at the age of maturity and he displayed his virtue and abilities to the Egyptians. The Egyptians interpreted Moses' actions as their imminent doom and the elevation of the Hebrews. During the course of Egyptian history, there were many wars with the Kushite kingdom of Ethiopia. Sometimes this region is known as Nubia. When Moses had reached the age of maturity, the Ethiopians were making incursions into Egyptian territory. The Egyptians were in a state of bitter distress because of these predatory attacks. Josephus said that they penetrated as far as the city of Memphis near the Nile Delta. Because of the urgency of the military situation, the Egyptians made an inquiry through the oracles and the prophecies. They were told by their God to secure the assistance of Moses. Then Pharaoh commanded his daughter to bring Moses into his presence, but first Pharaoh had to swear to his daughter that no misfortune would happen to him. Moses was brought into Pharaoh's presence, informed of the deteriorating military situation, and given generalship of the Egyptian army. The Egyptian priests gave only tacit approbation to his new assignment. They were skeptical of his loyalty, and hoped that he would be killed in the ensuing battles. The Hebrews were greatly exuberant because of the promotion of Moses. They expected Moses to liberate them. Moses marshaled his army and marched southward. He did not follow the Nile, but took the inland route, cognizant of the fact that the Ethiopians would be most vigilant at the river, but the land route presented a severe danger. It was inhabited with deadly serpents, which this area produced in mass numbers. Legend says that these snakes fly in the air and descend on men unaware. For that reason, Moses devised an ingenious plan to combat these evil creatures. He filled baskets with an animal called ibis and transported them along with him. These ibis are very dangerous to the snake family, they fly after the snakes and consume them completely. When Moses approached the land of the serpents, he let loose the ibis, and they destroyed the snakes. Then Moses came upon the Ethiopians secretly, vanquished them in battle and demolished their cities. Those that escaped retreated to Saba, Sheba, their capital. Josephus says that Saba was a royal city of the Ethiopians which Emperor Cambyses of Persia afterwards renamed Meroe, after his sister. The capital of Ethiopia used to be located at Napata, at the Fourth Cataract. Later it was moved to Meroe. Moses found the city of Meroe well fortified. It was surrounded by a high wall, and there was a river around the wall that made it look like an island. The city was constructed so strongly that when the water of the river became violent, it could not move the foundation of the city. The city of Meroe was extremely difficult to subdue and the army was lying idle. Then the daughter of the Ethiopian king happened to see Moses as he led the army near the wall, fighting with great gallantry. She finally arranged a treaty of peace with Moses, agreeing to surrender the city if he would marry her. Moses consummated the marriage and departed with his wife for Egypt. Moses returned to the capital of Egypt during the reign of one of the kings of the 19th dynasty, probably Ramses I, or Seti I. The Egyptians hated Moses even more when they found out that he was successful in battle. The Egyptians became suspicious of Moses because they thought he would incite a slave insurrection, so they conspired to assassinate him. When Moses learned of the conspiracy, he escaped to the land of Midian. Ramses II was the fourth king of the 19th dynasty, 1292 to 1225 SC, and the son of Seti I. He was pure black, had thick lips and a broad nose like the people of the western Sudan today. He was a warlike pharaoh, industrious and energetic, ruling Egypt for 67 years. In the early years of his reign, he engaged in the important campaign against the Hittites. At Kadesh, near Syria, the battle was indecisive. Finally, he signed a permanent peace treaty with the king of the Hittites, married the king's daughter, and the remaining years of his life were relatively peaceful. Ramses II is also known for his national public work projects. Because these projects required the forced labor of thousands of Hebrew slaves, he is known as the Pharaoh of the oppression. He was a boastful, vainglorious, tyrannical personality who sought to astound humanity by covering the country with megalithic structures. This Ramses transferred the capital to the Nile Delta. The Black Jews constructed the treasure cities, Pithom and Ramses. Ramses developed the Nile Delta and had the slaves build Egypt's megaliths, the colonnade at Luxor and its gigantic pylon, in front of which he placed 6 colossal statues of himself. Each of these statues was almost 60 feet high. Ramses II erased his predecessors' names from the records and substituted his own. This Ramses also constructed the hypostyle hall at Karnak and the temple called the Ramesseum near Thebes. During this period, Egypt enjoyed a high degree of prosperity, a great boom just before the recession. When Merneptah, the son of Ramses II, came to the throne, the entire empire was falling apart. Moses entered Egypt, probably during the reign of Ramses II or Merneptah. He, Moses, was commissioned by the God of Israel to go down into Egypt and to tell Pharaoh to let his people go. Moses did not have any great difficulty entering the palace of Pharaoh. He had been reared in the king's palace, and he knew Egyptian protocol. He decided to enter the palace at the time that Pharaoh was entertaining various ambassadors from foreign nations. After Egypt was weakened and terrified by the scourge of the 10 plagues, Pharaoh agreed to emancipate the Hebrew slaves. Beginning with the reign of Merneptah and the kings of the 20th dynasty, Egypt was in a state of decline. There were revolts throughout the empire. It is evident that the emancipation of the Hebrew slaves may have triggered these revolts, producing a chain reaction. Weakness at home and attack from the external enemies marked the defeat and decline of the empire. In the 10th century BC, the Libyans invaded Egypt and established the 22nd Bubastite dynasty. Under this Libyan dynasty, Egypt tried to revive the empire. Shishak or Shishak invaded Palestine and entered into combat with the Davidic dynasty. At this time, most of Shishak's troops were Libyans and Cushites. After 200 years of Libyan rule, The Kushites invaded Egypt in the middle fast, making themselves a great power. Then the Assyrians, Babylonians, Persians, Greeks, Romans, and Arabs invaded Egypt consecutively, terminating Egyptian rule. Kush,